do you ever really know if someone's been de-radicalised? And therefore, should Shamima ever be allowed to come home? On one side of this, we've got Mark Stevens, human rights lawyer. On the other side, we've got Jerry Hayes, criminal barrister and former Conservative MP. People, it's time. Let's do it. Right, so it's a lovely crass intro music there that we've got for this. Look, Shamima Begum, do we ever know if someone's being de-radicalised? Now, we all know the drill by now, people. Each of my esteemed guests gets 60 seconds to state their case, and then we just get stuck into the wider debate. And I'm going to start with you, Mark Stevens, human rights lawyer. That's okay. Thank you very much for joining us. Your 60 seconds starts now. Do you ever really know if someone's been de-radicalised?
The answer is that you don't know. But you have to go through the de-radicalisation process because it's impractical for a government to keep people incarcerated permanently. And the evidence shows that with bit part players, wives, children, those sorts of people, the results are better than with people who are radicalised. But we worked fairly well in Northern Ireland when we let people out. It also works in other countries of the world, but it has to be tapered to the individual, and generic systems are almost a waste of money. But we spend millions on this for good and decent reasons, and it works at least in part.
You're within your 60 seconds, so we did not have the opportunity to brutally cut you off with a boxing bell. Jerry Hayes, criminal barrister and former Conservative MP. Do you ever really know, your 60 seconds starts now, do you ever really know if someone's been de-radicalised?
No, of course. The classic example is the guy at the fishmonger's hall. He went on a de-radicalised program. It didn't work. And the fact is, I'm a great believer in redemption. Of course I am. I think just about every person behind bars can be redeemed, with probably the exception of paedophiles, because it's more a disease than anything else that they just can't shake off. So what about Begum? Well, she made her own bed. Admittedly, she was 15 years old. She was radicalized. She had every opportunity to actually turn her back on this. Admittedly, she was only 15, but she looked, she went, and she became an enemy of this country and everything we stand for. We just don't know what we will be doing. And it's interesting that now, after a long, long time, when she has never condemned what actually happened in the country that she's never condemned.
There it is. We got to wheel it out eventually. That's our brutally insensitive boxing bell. Jerry, good stuff. We're going to be returning to all of that, frankly. Just Mark, I'm going to throw back to you now. Do you think she should come back home? Do you think that we should have Shamima back here?
I think it depends on her particular circumstances. But the question that's often not asked about de-radicalisation programmes is, what's the alternative? Do we just lock them up and throw away the key?
I'd say yes to that.
That may be an answer, but it's not actually a very practical one. We see it with the Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere. And ultimately, with domestic terrorists, as we saw in Northern Ireland, we're also now seeing with jihadis, again, we can't just afford to throw away the key. So de-radicalisation has a place to play, but there will always be some people who are beyond redemption. And I think we both agree on that.
Jerry, same thing to you. Go on.
Very good point. No, Mark raises a very good point, and we're at one on this. The difficulty is for Shamima Begum, she's out of the system. She's not a British citizen anymore. Therefore, why should we do it? That is the difficulty. Now, we've got people over here who've convicted of terrorism offences, and we've got to do our very best to de-radicalise them, because otherwise they're going to be a problem. I've got no difficulty with that. But Shamima Begum is a different kettle of fish altogether. She rejected the country, and what the Home Secretary did was merely formalise it and say, you're no longer a British citizen. Admittedly, the process still goes on and she can still appeal this. I think the Supreme Court was wrong not to let her come back, not to stay, but to fight her case. But that's an argument.
But Jerry, I think the mistake that we're making here is that displacement of radical people into other countries ultimately doesn't help this country. We have to work on de-radicalisation irrespective of geography, because actually the best way to redemption is to have people who give up and forego their previous terroristic
But
tendencies.
the thing is, for me, and this is just a really sad fact about this, is there's not a cut and dry test, apart from maybe a lie detector test, actually, as to whether or not you have actually, denounced your past, as it were. And for me, especially we live in this age now where all of our freedoms are being curtailed on the grounds of public health. For me, it seems like a complete misnomer, the idea that, if we're so concerned about public health, that we basically let allegedly reformed jihadis back out onto the streets, Mark. I don't quite see how that squares up.
Well, I think the key question here is, what is de-radicalization? And I think it's integration back into society, making them useful members of society and agreeing to non-violence. And I think you can get a large proportion of the people to that place. I think the difficulty is those recidivists who will never repent, never recant. And that's the difficult nub of it. And I think those are the people that you have to deal with perhaps more in the way that you and Jerry would appreciate.
Yeah, look, Jerry, I'm going to throw it over to you now. For me, it is, look, I get that there are issues relating to whether or not you can just lock someone away for the rest of their natural lives. Right? But for me, I just think you lost your human rights when you became a terrorist. And I would rather pay the price, whatever it costs for you to sit in a prison and rot, than actually you be out on the streets, Jerry.
Yeah, but there are two totally separate arguments. Once you've been a convicted terrorist, you don't throw away the key. That's not the way we do things in this country, and it's against the rule of law. It's against just about everything, every international treaty we've signed. So that's not an issue. Let's park that. We're talking about this girl who's no longer a British citizen. Has she renounced the violence? No, the answer is she's never renounced the violence. And there's a PR campaign going on here. We noticed in the press there were pictures of her not as the grieving mother, which was very sad, in her in her outfit. There were pictures of her in Western dress, designer sunglasses, and now it's been leaked out she was just not wanting to be left behind, which is clearly nonsense, because there were lots of interventions to try and stop it. The difficulty with her is she's not a British citizen. Therefore, we have no responsibility. For those people in prison, we do, because we're going to have to deal with them. They're going to get back on the streets at some time. However, prisons have become hotbeds of radicalization. We put them all together in the same way we put the pedophiles all together in prison, which is not a good idea. And there's talk now of moving the prison operation to the Home Office. What a disaster that would be. But nevertheless, that is the problem. Radicalization in our prisons. Shamima Begum, I don't think anyone really suggests that she sensibly can come back. It's a bit of a PR stunt she's pulling. I'm not impressed.
I suppose Jerry's raised an interesting point there, Mark, hasn't he? Which probably really goes against my idea of just lock them away, which is essentially you just do then turn those prisons into hotbeds of jihadi radicalization, don't you? I suppose that's
yeah, and of course the gangs in prison, the protection gangs in prison, are very often along religious lines, and therefore if you want protection you have to convert to being a jihadi. And so that actually putting them in prison, for those people who are not going to be convicted of terrorist offences, they're likely to be radicalized in prison. So therefore it does say, I think this is why governments around the world spend money on rehabilitation programs, is because it is the only practical option. But again, they need to be very carefully tailored, and the people need to be scrutinized incredibly carefully before they come out. And clearly that was a failure with the fishmonger's killer.
If someone... Go on, Jerry.
I was just going to say, the trouble is you're never going to have the resources to follow absolutely everybody. And that's why you have the systems of house arrest. Again, not terribly practical, because at the end of the day, the people have served their time. And this is a dilemma for society, and it's a dilemma for the security services as well. You cannot have people who are suspected of terrorism, who've committed terrorism offences, under 24-hour surveillance. As simple as that. So an option, Mark says, yeah, let's try and de-radicalize. But it's darn difficult. And the answer to your question, Patrick, is we just don't know until something goes wrong.
Well, exactly that. Mark, I've got to ask Mark, let's just say someone's been in prison for a few years, they've on terrorism offences, and they say they've gone through a de-radicalisation programme and all of that, and we're about to unleash them. Would you let them come and live with you?
I think probably not, because the de-radicalisation programs are not that good. And prison is not the place for de-radicalisation. The people who are most successful on this, and the research shows that actually the countries which actually put people into specialist programs and isolate them, albeit locked up, but they don't do it in a general prison. And that's the mistake that this government makes, and I think is a long-term problem for us.
Yeah, I mean, Jerry, I'm going to ask you the same thing, because I understand obviously your times as a criminal barrister, you have a very strong notion of the rule of law, and I do get that, and it's certainly stronger than mine, which is probably why I'm nowhere near power.
Oh,
but
you just said something incredibly dangerous off the cuff. You don't have a strong adherence to the rule of law.
Because I'd lock them.
You don't mean that, do you? I know this is talk radio, but it's not bonkers.
I know, I do. You see, because when it comes to how I treat these people, yeah, clearly, I clearly am willing to suspend all of their human rights. I absolutely am. I think that's just a fact.
No, this cannot be the station of common sense. If you say it's
I think
one
that's
law,
a really common sense view. I think most barristers would agree with me. I honestly, I get what you're saying, but this is my point as well. All right, I'm going to ask you the same thing as well. If we don't lock these people away and throw away the key, eventually then they come out again. Would you let them live with you? Because they're going to live somewhere. It's fine. It's fine if they're not living anywhere near you, is it?
I wouldn't invite them to live with me.
Invite them round, yeah.
I shouldn't think they'd want to live with me. There's too much alcohol in them.
You're good fun.
They wouldn't agree to it.
Yeah, but this is the point, though. These people, they make these decisions. These people do get back out on the streets, and they do love to live next door to someone. Yeah,
I think I don't mind them living near me. I think that's the issue. The question is, they obviously have families, and they want to be with those families. And the question is that a safe environment? And you don't release them unless it is a safe environment. And so that is really the issue that we have in play. And the system that we have in this country is imperfect. There are much better systems that we see around the world. And there's a particular professor at University in Singapore, Gunaratnam, who actually is very, very good on this and has done the comparative work. And it does show that specialist rehabilitation centres do work, but it has to be with integration back into society, whereas we're not seeing that in this country. Basically, when you've served your time, they open the door and they push you out, and it just doesn't work well.
Yeah. Jerry, do we need to massively boost the amount of police or intelligence officers or something? Is that one way to combat it? Because that might actually stop the radicalisation happening in the first place.
Not really. People are radicalized for all sorts of reasons. Very often they tend to be petty, violent criminals, actually. Nothing much to do with religion. They're outside of society to begin with. So the radicalization is just a tiny little nudge of the difficulties they're having in the first place. A lot of people who went out to fight are violent people with violent records who have terrible reputations with the way that they treat women. So you've got a little thug drug dealer who likes beating people up and likes abusing women. Wow, go and fight for ISIS. It's made for you.
Well, it is,
I think one of the key issues that we've really got to focus on, what is an effective de-radicalization program? And it seems to me it has to have three targets. It's got to attack the religious ideology. It's got to attack the structural and political grievances, and it's got to deal with post-trauma conflict or post-conflict trauma. And currently, our de-radicalization programs don't do that in this country. And so we are ineffective because the programs that they do have in prison don't address the three key issues. And then, of course, you need to ensure that they become part of a meaningful society afterwards and not continue with their violence.
We're getting a lot of tweets, as you can imagine, out Talk Radio. We'll call us as well. What's your view on this? 03444991000. And a lot of the people tweeting in are saying it's easily solved if we reintroduce the death penalty for terrorists. Your views, Jerry?
No. As someone who's been on the IRA death list and had armed protection for a long time, as someone who actually served in the Northern Ireland office, one of the arguments we had, and I've always been against the death penalty, despite the fact that my grandfather was murdered when I was 12. It's not a deterrent. And in fact, it is quite the opposite way. You're making martyrs. For the IRA, it would have been a recruiting sergeant. For the jihadist, wow, this is fantastic. You're going to make me a martyr. I'm going to go to paradise with, 75 virgins for eternity, which is not very many, to be honest.
Not for eternity.
not a good deal, is it? Really, when you think of it.
Also,
And not a good-
they didn't specify
Well,
they didn't specify the quality of Virgin either, Jerry. You know, I can imagine that it's all these kind of like, they get up there and they realise that it's just a load of spotty Warhammer obsessed geeks, you know, and they realise they'd misinterpreted it. You know,
No. This is the problem. The death penalty is not a deterrent, and it never has been. You can look through all the statistics. It makes people feel better who are sitting at home saying this is absolutely disgraceful, absolutely disgusting, and I can sympathise with that. But it's not going to solve the problem. It's going to make it considerably worse.
Mark, as a human rights lawyer, I can imagine where you're going to sit on this particular offence. But yeah, death penalty for terrorists. Your view?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's not appropriate, and actually it lowers us to their level to have judicial killings. The reality is, as Jerry has adeptly pointed out, it acts as a recruiting sergeant and actually makes people into deities for their cause. And we want to avoid that. I mean, just think about how Bobby Sands became a deity in Northern Ireland. It didn't work, and he killed himself. But for people who are killed, then in those circumstances, it really doesn't solve the problem. We're much better tackling the three key issues about what has made them radicalized, whether it's religious or political or something else. Deal with those issues, and then I think you can win hearts and minds and improve people.
Both of you, fantastic stuff. Really, really enjoyed that. Mark Stevens, human rights lawyer, and Jerry Hayes, well, criminal barrister, former Conservative MP, just having it out really over the Shamima Begum latest and essentially the wider topic of, do you ever really know if someone's been de-radicalised?